At 6:35 in the evening of February 3, 1945, advance units of the American 1st Cavalry Division entered Manila from the north along Highway 3. Within hours of the Americans' arrival, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi gave the order that made the title of this video true. He then ordered the systematic destruction of the city he had been explicitly ordered to abandon. Incendiary squads moved immediately through the districts north of the Pasig River. Buildings were set on fire. Bridges were dynamited. General Tomoyuki Yamashita had ordered Iwabuchi in January to withdraw from Manila entirely, to preserve his forces and spare the city and its 1 million inhabitants. Iwabuchi had not withdrawn. He had stayed because Manila was the battle where he intended to die, and because the specific disgrace of having survived the sinking of the battleship Kirishima at Guadalcanal in November of 1942 had followed him for 26 months. He chose to die in Manila rather than withdraw. 100,000 Filipino civilians who had made no such choice died alongside him in the 29 days that followed his decision. 100,000 Filipino civilians dead, 16,000 Japanese soldiers dead, 1,010 Americans dead, 29 days. One admiral who chose to stay and die when he had been ordered to leave. One general who ordered the withdrawal that might have saved them, and was hanged after the war for failing to stop what happened when his order was disobeyed. I spent 7 hours writing, editing, and researching this story to verify every casualty figure and every command decision exactly right, because the Battle of Manila is the only major engagement of the Pacific War in which the officer who caused the destruction died before the war ended, and the officer who tried to prevent it was executed for it, and because the 100,000 Filipino civilians who died have not been given the accounting their deaths require. If this story matters to you, subscribe to the channel. Just subscribe. That is all. Thank you. In November of 1942, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi commanded the Japanese battleship Kirishima during the naval battle of Guadalcanal in the waters north of that island. On the night of November 14th to 15th, the American battleship USS Washington fired 42 16-inch shells and dozens of 5-inch shells at the Kirishima at ranges as close as 8 kilometers. The Kirishima absorbed 9 16-inch armor-piercing shell hits. She began flooding almost immediately as water entered through the shell penetrations. Her steering was destroyed. She began to list and could not be controlled. The order to abandon ship was given. The Kirishima capsized and sank in approximately 3 hours of flooding. Iwabuchi survived the sinking. In the Japanese naval culture of the 1940s, the survival of a ship's commander after the sinking of his vessel was a recognized source of personal and professional disgrace. A commander of a warship was expected to die with his ship. Iwabuchi had not died with the Kirishima when she went down. He had survived and been rescued by another Japanese warship. For the next 2 years, he served in staff positions and secondary commands, carrying the specific weight that his survival at Guadalcanal had placed on him in a culture that had clear expectations about what he should have done. In late 1944, he was assigned to command the Manila Naval Defense Force, responsible for the naval installations, port facilities, and the naval defense of the Philippine capital. Manila in 1944 was a city of approximately 1 million people. It was one of the most beautiful cities in Asia. The Spanish colonial architecture of Intramuros, the walled city constructed in the 16th century, had survived 4 centuries. The Manila Hotel, the finest hotel in Southeast Asia, had been the residence of General Douglas MacArthur before the war. The University of Santo Tomas held thousands of Allied civilian internees who had been imprisoned since the Japanese occupation began in January of 1942. Manila was a city that had survived 3 years of Japanese occupation and that the Filipino population expected to survive the liberation that MacArthur had promised would come. General Tomoyuki Yamashita commanded all Japanese forces in the Philippines. In January of 1945, Yamashita made a strategic assessment that led to one of the most consequential orders of the Pacific War. He concluded in late January that Manila could not be defended against the American forces that had landed at Lingayen Gulf and were advancing south. The city was flat terrain, surrounded on multiple sides, and its civilian population of 1 million made any military operation inside it catastrophically expensive in civilian lives. He ordered the complete withdrawal of Japanese forces from Manila to the mountains east and north of the city, where the terrain could be used to extend Japanese resistance. His withdrawal order applied to all Japanese forces in the Manila area, including the naval units under Iwabuchi's command. The chain of command between the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Philippines was not unified in a way that gave Yamashita direct authority to compel compliance from a naval officer of Iwabuchi's rank. Iwabuchi received the withdrawal order. He read it. He did not comply. He believed his primary obligation was to defend the naval base installations and to destroy the port facilities that would otherwise fall intact to the Americans. He may also have understood his decision in deeply personal terms related to the Kirishima. Manila was the place where he could die in the fighting that the sinking of the Kirishima had denied him in November of 1942. He stayed in Manila and organized his approximately 16,000 sailors and soldiers into defensive positions across the southern half of the city. He prepared for a battle that Yamashita had correctly assessed as both militarily futile and catastrophically costly to Manila, its structures, and its civilian population of 1 million. The American liberation of Manila began with a speed that created a false and dangerous impression of what was coming. The 1st Cavalry Division entered the city on February 3rd and rapidly seized the Malacañang Palace, the official residence of the Philippine Commonwealth government. That same evening, troops reached the University of Santo Tomas, where approximately 3,700 Allied civilian internees had been held for 3 years in conditions of progressive starvation and neglect. The liberation of the internees at Santo Tomas was genuine and complete, and was achieved within the first hours of the Americans' entry into the city. General MacArthur declared Manila liberated on February 6th, 3 days after the first American troops had entered the city from the north. The declaration was premature by 25 days and 100,000 Filipino civilian deaths. Iwabuchi's 16,000 defenders were not in the northern districts where the Americans had entered. They were in the south, in the commercial and residential districts on the other side of the Pasig River, in the government buildings, in the churches, in the walled city of Intramuros. When the Americans crossed the Pasig River and encountered the fortified defensive positions Iwabuchi had established in the southern city, the battle that would destroy Manila began in its actual and devastating form. The American tactical problem in the southern city was that Iwabuchi's defenders had converted every substantial building into a fortified position. Schools, hospitals, churches, government offices, and residential compounds had been reinforced with machine gun nests, artillery positions, and pre-registered fields of fire covering the approaches. The Japanese had booby-trapped streets, demolished major bridges across the Pasig River, and placed depth charges repurposed as landmines across the approach routes. Each city block became a separate engagement, requiring the systematic reduction of each fortified building individually, with each building potentially holding dozens of armed defenders. American infantry casualties in these engagements were severe enough that the divisional and corps commanders sought a solution that would reduce American losses. General MacArthur had initially prohibited the use of heavy artillery and air support in Manila to protect civilian lives and the city's structures. By February 9th, the cost of infantry-only assault had become unsustainable. The restriction on artillery was lifted on February 9th. American artillery batteries fired directly into buildings held by Japanese defenders at ranges sometimes as short as 250 yards. They fired 185 tons of ammunition into Intramuros alone between February 17th and 23rd. The buildings came down. The Japanese defenders died in them. The Filipino civilians who were inside those buildings, because Iwabuchi's troops had forced them there as human shields, or who had sheltered inside what they believed were protected structures, died in the same buildings. The Filipino civilian deaths in Manila came from two distinct sources. Approximately 40% of the total civilian deaths, by a Japanese post-war estimate, were caused by American artillery. The remaining 60% were caused by the deliberate and documented actions of Iwabuchi's forces. The deliberate deaths are what the historical documentary record has preserved with the greatest specificity. At Fort Santiago, The 16th century fortress in Intramuros, Japanese troops herded more than 3,000 Filipino civilians into the stone underground dungeons of the colonial prison. Dr. Antonio Gisbert, a physician, was among the survivors. He told military investigators afterward that fewer than 50 people of those 3,000 had come out of Fort Santiago alive. At the San Juan de Dios Hospital, Japanese soldiers entered the patient wards and killed patients and medical personnel. At the Philippine General Hospital, patients and civilians who had taken refuge there were killed as the battle progressed. At San Agustin Church in Intramuros, approximately 6,000 civilians who had sought refuge were killed. Across the districts of Malate, Ermita, and Paco, families were gathered into buildings that were then set on fire or destroyed with explosives. Iwabuchi's troops used Filipino civilians as human shields in their defensive positions. They placed civilians at the front of their lines and on the exteriors of their fortifications, a practice documented in American after-action reports and in the testimony of survivors. Those who survived being used as shields were often killed by the Japanese afterward when the positions became untenable. The systematic nature of the killing was documented by the American investigators who followed the advancing infantry units. Second Lieutenant John Hanley's team surveyed the grounds of the Die Pack lumber yard on February 7th and found more than 100 civilian bodies, dressed in everyday clothing, killed in the days immediately before the Americans arrived. The battle compressed into Intramuros in the third week of February 1945. Approximately 2,000 Japanese defenders occupied the 160 acres of the ancient walled city. They held thousands of Filipino civilians as hostages inside the 16th century walls. The American artillery bombardment of the walled city reduced its interior to rubble. The outer walls, built of stone 3 to 7 meters thick and dating from the 16th century, partially survived. The Cathedral of Manila, the national Catholic shrine of the Philippines, was destroyed in the fighting inside the walls. The Ateneo de Manila, the historic Jesuit institution with roots in the 16th century, was destroyed. The original fabric of the oldest European urban settlement in the Philippines, accumulated over 4 centuries of occupation, was reduced to rubble in 8 days of sustained artillery fire. Iwabuchi committed suicide on February 26, 1945, as the Americans broke through the final Japanese defenses in Intramuros. He died in the manner he had chosen when he made the decision to stay in Manila rather than comply with Yamashita's withdrawal order in January. The Japanese naval and army forces that had defended Manila were essentially destroyed. Of the approximately 16,000 Japanese who had remained in Manila, virtually none survived the battle. The last organized Japanese resistance in the government buildings east of Intramuros collapsed in the final days of February and the first days of March. The legislative building fell on February 28th. The agricultural building fell on March 1st. The finance building fell on March 3rd. On March 4th, Manila was officially declared liberated. The city that MacArthur had prematurely declared liberated on February 6th was officially liberated 26 days later on March 4th. The intervening 26 days had produced the additional tens of thousands of civilian deaths that the premature declaration on February 6th had not yet counted. The physical accounting of what the battle produced was recorded in the weeks afterward. More than 600 city blocks had been completely destroyed. 70% of Manila's utilities were eliminated. 72% of its industrial capacity was gone. 100% of its business district was destroyed. Manila was the second most devastated Allied capital city of the entire Second World War, surpassed in destruction only by Warsaw. The question of whether Manila needed to be fought the way it was fought has been debated by military historians for 80 years. The core argument for the inevitability of what happened runs as follows. Iwabuchi's refusal to withdraw made urban combat inside Manila unavoidable. Urban combat in a city of 1 million people, with 16,000 determined defenders in fortified positions, could not be conducted without heavy artillery unless the command was willing to accept American infantry casualties at a rate it was not willing to sustain. The restrictions on artillery were therefore lifted, and the city was destroyed. The argument against this is that the restriction on heavy artillery was lifted after 9 days, not after it had been given an adequate test, and that the scale of the bombardment applied to Intramuros exceeded what military necessity could justify given the civilian population trapped inside the ancient walls. Both arguments are supported by the detailed documentary record. The decision to lift the artillery restriction was made in the direct context of real and rising American casualties. The resulting destruction of Intramuros and the deaths of the civilians within it were equally real. MacArthur's personal connection to Manila had specific consequences for the battle. He had lived in Manila for years before the war, including in the penthouse suite of the Manila Hotel. He had commanded the Philippine Commonwealth Army from Manila before his evacuation to Australia in March of 1942 under orders from President Roosevelt. Manila was not simply a strategic military objective to him. It was the city he had promised to return to, and the city to which he had made the most famous promise of the Pacific War. His premature declaration on February 6th that Manila had been liberated was a political and symbolic statement about the returning American commander, not an accurate military assessment of a city still being contested building by building. When American troops reached the Manila Hotel on February 22nd, MacArthur visited his former penthouse suite. It was in ashes. He had returned to Manila, and Manila had been destroyed before he arrived. Those Allied nationals had been prisoners of the Japanese occupation since January of 1942. 3 years of detention, progressive food reduction, and deteriorating physical conditions had left many of them on the visible and documented edge of starvation. The liberation of Santo Tomas was the genuine early success of the Manila operation, achieved rapidly and without the urban destruction that would characterize every subsequent phase. The internees who walked out of Santo Tomas that night walked into a city that was about to be destroyed in the weeks around them. Many of them spent the following weeks in makeshift facilities on the northern outskirts of the city, while the fighting continued through the streets they had been liberated into. The systematic quality of the Japanese atrocities in Manila has been documented more thoroughly than almost any comparable event in the Pacific War. American military investigators followed the infantry units and documented what they found in each location as it was secured. Filipino survivors gave testimony to military investigators and to journalists in the days and weeks after each area was cleared. The combined documentary record, compiled during the subsequent war crimes investigation and at the trial of Yamashita, listed specific incidents with specific locations, dates, and death counts. The formal charges against Yamashita enumerated 62,278 tortured and murdered civilians, 144 killed American military personnel, and 488 documented and separately recorded cases of rape. These numbers represented the documented and evidenced minimum, not the total. The total civilian dead of 100,000 included deaths from all causes, including direct massacre, battle crossfire, starvation, and disease. The specific incident at the Daipak lumber yard, where American investigators found more than 100 Filipino civilian bodies in the first days of the battle, established the pattern of what was being systematically done in the city ahead of the American advance. The victims were not soldiers. They had not been killed in crossfire. They had been gathered and executed. Their clothing, the positions of the bodies, and the nature of the wounds were entirely consistent with organized mass execution rather than incidental combat deaths. This was the specific pattern that American investigators documented across dozens of separate locations as the battle progressed. Places where Filipino civilians had been gathered, held, and killed in organized operations that were clearly distinct from the combat occurring around them. Iwabuchi's forces included approximately 12,500 naval personnel from the Manila Naval Defense Force and approximately 4,500 Japanese Army soldiers under Colonel Katsuzo Noguchi. The naval personnel were not trained or adequately equipped for infantry combat in an urban environment. They were sailors and naval technicians who had been assigned to ground fighting positions. Their tactical performance reflected this background. They were effective in fixed defensive positions and largely ineffective in the kind of flexible mobile defense that might have extended the battle while reducing civilian casualties. Yamashita's assessment that the city could not be successfully defended was correct not only in the strategic sense, but in the tactical sense as well. The 16,000 defenders had the capacity to make the battle extremely costly for the Americans. They did not have the capacity to hold Manila indefinitely, to win or to survive. General Tomoyuki Yamashita surrendered to American forces on September 2, 1945, the same day Japan signed the formal surrender documents on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. He walked out of the mountains of northern Luzon, where he had spent the final months of the war, conducting his withdrawal defense, and surrendered to the American forces that had been pursuing him. He was tried for war crimes in Manila, in a battle-scarred hearing room in the city his withdrawal order had tried to save, before a military commission of 5 American generals. The trial began on October 29, 1945, and ran for 32 days. He was convicted on December 7, 1945, and executed by hanging on February 23, 1946, exactly 1 year and 8 days after American forces entered the city on February 3rd. The officer whose January withdrawal order could have prevented the destruction was executed for the destruction his subordinate caused by ignoring it. The Yamashita trial established what has become known in international law as the Yamashita Standard, or the principle of command responsibility. The principle holds that any military commander can be held legally liable for crimes committed by forces under his command, even without direct proof that the commander ordered the specific crimes or knew specifically that they were being committed. The prosecution did not argue that Yamashita had ordered the Manila massacre. It argued that as the commanding general of all Japanese forces in the Philippines, he was legally responsible for crimes committed by those forces, regardless of whether he had ordered or been informed of specific incidents. The defense argued that Yamashita had no effective control over the naval forces under Iwabuchi, that he had in fact ordered the withdrawal from Manila, and that the breakdown of communications during the American offensive had made oversight impossible. The commission convicted him anyway. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the central paradox of the Manila massacre: why the general who tried to prevent the massacre was executed for it, while the admiral who caused it died before any trial, what the battle produced for the city of Manila and for international law, and what 100,000 Filipino civilians who made no choice about any of it represent in the accounting of what the Pacific War actually cost. Do not go anywhere. The legal scholarship on the Yamashita trial has been deeply and continuously divided since the verdict was announced. The dissenting justices of the United States Supreme Court, which declined to overturn the conviction on appeal, wrote opinions directly questioning whether the evidence supported the application of the command responsibility standard to Yamashita's specific situation. Justice Frank Murphy wrote in his dissent that the trial was a product of the wartime passion for vengeance rather than a measured and principled application of the laws of war. Justice Wiley Rutledge wrote a separate concurring dissent. Both justices noted that the prosecution had not established that Yamashita had ordered the atrocities, had known of them in time to prevent them, or had possessed the command and communications capacity to prevent them even if he had been informed. None of these objections changed the outcome of the case. Yamashita was hanged in the Philippines in February of 1946. The specific irony of the Yamashita case is that the precedent it established is a good principle of international law. Commanders should be held responsible for what their forces do. The problem with the Yamashita case as the founding precedent for that principle is that Yamashita had issued the specific order that, if obeyed, would have prevented what his forces did in Manila. He was executed under the principle of command responsibility for the actions of a subordinate who disobeyed the command that would have produced different actions. The principle is legally and morally correct. The founding case punished a commander for the actions of a subordinate who had specifically disobeyed him. Iwabuchi was posthumously promoted to vice admiral by the Japanese government after the war. He had held the rank of rear admiral when the Battle of Manila began on February 3, 1945. He committed suicide on February 26, before any formal investigation of the Manila massacre had begun, before any war crimes tribunal had been established, and before the final outcome of the war had been formally determined. The admiral who supervised the forces that killed 100,000 Filipino civilians and who destroyed a city that had been called the Pearl of the Orient was promoted posthumously for his conduct. He was never tried. He was never held accountable by any legal mechanism of the post-war order. His conduct in Manila was, from the perspective of the surviving Japanese military and government structure in the immediate post-war period, formally characterized as honorable service to the empire. The physical destruction of Manila was the second greatest destruction of any Allied capital city of the Second World War. Only Warsaw, which the German occupying forces systematically destroyed in 1944 in retaliation for the Warsaw Uprising, exceeded Manila in the absolute scale of built environment destruction. In Manila, more than 600 individual city blocks were completely leveled. The historic district of Intramuros, representing 4 centuries of continuous architectural and cultural development from the Spanish colonial era, was essentially destroyed in its totality. The Cathedral of Manila, the Augustinian Church of San Agustin, the Church of Santa Ana, dozens of other historic structures, and the entire commercial district of the city were gone. The physical rebuilding of Manila took decades and was never complete in the sense of restoring what had previously existed there. The San Agustin Church in Intramuros is the specific exception that illustrates the scale of what was lost everywhere else. It is one of the oldest stone buildings in the Philippines, completed in its current form in 1607. It survived the battle because its walls were thick enough to withstand the artillery bombardment that destroyed everything around it. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It stands in a district that was otherwise leveled. The buildings that should have stood alongside it for the next century are gone. The church's survival makes visible by contrast what was lost. The Filipino civilian dead of the Battle of Manila represent one of the largest single concentrations of civilian deaths in a single engagement of the Pacific War. The figure of 100,000 is the minimum documented estimate. Some historians, examining the civilian casualty rate for the entire battle, including deaths from starvation and disease in the period immediately afterward, suggest the actual number was higher. The 100,000 number is the figure that appears in the official Philippine government records and in the charges compiled against Yamashita. It is also the number that does not appear in most Western general histories of the Pacific War, which treat the Battle of Manila as a relatively brief episode between the Lingayen Gulf landings and the Iwo Jima assault, giving it less space than battles that cost fewer civilian lives. November 15, 1942, Kirishima sinks, Iwabuchi survives. January 1945, MacArthur's forces land at Lingayen Gulf. Yamashita orders withdrawal from Manila. Iwabuchi stays. February 3, 6:35 p.m. First American forces enter Manila. Liberation of Santo Tomas internees that night. February 6th, MacArthur prematurely declares Manila liberated. February 9th, artillery restriction lifted. Heavy bombardment begins. February 3rd to 23rd, systematic massacres across the southern city. Fort Santiago, San Juan de Dios Hospital, San Agustin Church, Deepak Lumberyard. February 17th to 23rd, Manila artillery bombardment of Intramuros. 185 tons of ammunition, the ancient walled city largely destroyed. February 26th, Iwabuchi commits suicide. March 3rd, last organized Japanese resistance collapses. March 4th, Manila officially liberated. 100,000 Filipino civilians dead, 16,000 Japanese dead, 1,010 Americans dead. September 2nd, 1945, Yamashita surrenders in Luzon. December 7th, 1945, Yamashita convicted by military commission. February 23rd, 1946, Yamashita hanged at Los Baños, Laguna, Philippines. 4 factors explain the Battle of Manila: Iwabuchi's personal decision to stay and its roots in the Kirishima, the structural failure of the Japanese Army-Navy command relationship, the American artillery decision of February 9th, and the vulnerability of Manila's civilian population to a battle fought inside the city. The first factor was Iwabuchi's decision and its personal origins. Yamashita's order to withdraw was militarily correct and would have saved Manila and its population. Iwabuchi disobeyed it. The disobedience was partly rooted in his reading of his naval obligation to defend the port and partly in the specific personal history of the Kirishima, a Japanese naval commander who had survived the sinking of his battleship and who understood the cultural weight of that survival, made a different calculation than a Japanese naval commander without that history would have made. Manila offered the death in battle that the Kirishima had not. 100,000 Filipino civilians were the collateral cost of that personal accounting. The second factor was the Army-Navy command failure. The specific mechanism that allowed Iwabuchi to disobey Yamashita was the absence of unified command over Japanese Army and Navy forces in the Philippines. Yamashita commanded Army forces. He had no direct authority over Iwabuchi, who commanded naval forces under a separate command structure. The order to withdraw was communicated. It was received. It was not obeyed. The Japanese military structure that allowed a naval officer commanding 16,000 men in a major city to disregard a theater army commander's order because of a chain of command technicality was the structural failure that made the Manila massacre possible. The third factor was the artillery decision. MacArthur's initial prohibition of heavy artillery reflected an accurate assessment of what artillery inside Manila would produce. It was lifted because the alternative was sustaining American infantry casualties at a rate the command was not willing to sustain. The artillery produced the 40% of civilian deaths attributable to American fire. It also, eventually, ended the battle and reduced total American casualties. The question the artillery decision raises is whether the timing of the decision, lifting it after 9 days, represented a genuine assessment that infantry-only assault had reached its limits, or whether that assessment was premature. The documentary record does not resolve this question cleanly. The fourth factor was the civilian concentration in the battle zone. Manila was a city of 1 million people. The Japanese defenders converted the residential and commercial districts where 1 million people lived into fortified positions. The civilians could not leave. The Japanese prevented their exit in the early phase and used them as human shields in the final phase. The Americans advanced through positions where Filipino civilians were present in every structure. The 100,000 dead were the direct result of 1 million people being inside the perimeter of a battle they had not chosen and could not escape. The paradox at the center of the Battle of Manila is not subtle, but it is worth stating precisely. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi survived when the Kirishima went down in November of 1942. General Yamashita ordered him to withdraw from Manila in January of 1945. Iwabuchi refused. He remained because Manila was where he had decided to die. He died on February 26, 1945, by his own hand. As the Americans broke through his final defensive positions, 100,000 Filipino civilians died in the 29 days that followed. After the war, Yamashita, who had ordered the withdrawal that might have prevented the massacre, was tried, convicted, and hanged for the massacre under the principle of command responsibility. The principle is sound. The man it was applied to had given the order that the massacre's actual author had disobeyed. Iwabuchi was promoted posthumously. The admiral who chose to die took 100,000 people with him. The general who tried to stop him was executed for failing. The Philippine capital today holds more than 13 million people in its metropolitan area. Intramuros has been partially rebuilt and is a heritage site administered by the government. The San Agustin Church still stands inside the walls, surrounded by reconstructed buildings that do not look like the buildings they replaced. The Manila Hotel still operates. The penthouse where MacArthur had lived, which he found in ashes on February 22, 1945, has been restored. The Filipino civilians who died in February and March of 1945 do not have a memorial equivalent to the scale of their deaths. The battle that killed them is not well known outside the Philippines and among specialists in Pacific War history. The title of this video is an attempt at the minimum honest accounting that what happened in Manila requires. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you the stories, the histories reduced to a chapter between larger campaigns, without telling you that the general whose withdrawal order could have saved the city was executed for the destruction that the admiral who disobeyed him caused, that the disobedience was rooted partly in having survived the Kirishima at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier, that the principle of command responsibility, established at the Yamashita trial, is now a foundational element of international humanitarian law applied at every subsequent war crimes tribunal, or that the admiral who chose to die in Manila was promoted posthumously while the general who tried to prevent what he did was hanged for it. Hit subscribe, then like so this reaches the people who should understand what 100,000 Filipino dead in 29 days means about the cost of one officer's choice to die on his own terms. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one. The figure of 62,278 specifically documented victims listed in the Yamashita prosecution charges deserves a specific explanatory note. This was not the total number of Filipino civilians killed in Manila. It was the number for which specific evidence had been compiled, witnesses had been identified, and formal charges could be sustained. The investigators who assembled these charges worked through a destroyed city in the months after the battle, interviewing survivors and examining physical evidence at dozens of locations. The total civilian death count of 100,000 represents all causes of death during the battle: direct massacre, crossfire, starvation, disease, and the indirect effects of the destruction of Manila's civilian infrastructure. The 62,000 represented only the documented cases of direct killing by Japanese forces that the prosecution could sustain with specific evidence. Both numbers are part of the record of what happened in Manila in February and March of 1945. The Yamashita trial was conducted in Manila, in the building that had served as the Philippines High Commissioner's residence before the war, from October 29th to December 7th, 1945. 286 witnesses testified over 32 days of proceedings. The courtroom held up to 16,000 spectators during the most significant days of testimony. The witnesses included Filipino doctors, lawyers, teachers, and nurses who described what had happened to them and to their families. The pattern that emerged from the testimony was not the pattern of a military force that had lost discipline in the chaos of battle. It was the pattern of a systematic and institutional decision to kill civilians. The hospital killings, the church killings, the dungeon killings at Fort Santiago, and the lumberyard killings all shared the same organizational character. The civilians had been gathered. They had been held under guard. They had been killed. MacArthur's premature declaration of Manila's liberation on February 6th had specific consequences beyond the political embarrassment of being incorrect. It shaped the reporting that reached the American public and the Filipino public about what was happening in the city. For the weeks between February 6th and the actual end of the battle on March 3rd, the battle that was producing the greatest concentration of civilian deaths in the Pacific War was being reported to the world as a completed American victory. The people dying inside the city were dying in a battle that had already been officially declared over. The full accounting of what had happened did not reach the American and Filipino public until after the battle ended, when the investigators entered the city and the survivor testimonies began to be recorded. The question of what Manila would have looked like if Yamashita's withdrawal order had been obeyed is not answerable with certainty, but the parameters of the answer are clear. If Iwabuchi had withdrawn his 16,000 men from Manila in January of 1945 as ordered, there would have been no Japanese defenders in the city when the Americans arrived. Without Japanese defenders, there would have been no battle inside Manila. Without a battle inside Manila, the buildings would not have been destroyed, the civilians would not have been killed in the crossfire, and the systematic massacre would not have taken place. The American forces would have entered an undefended city and found a civilian population that had endured 3 years of Japanese occupation but remained physically intact. The city would have survived. The 100,000 civilians would have survived. Manila's status as the second most destroyed Allied capital of the Second World War would not have been earned. The rebuilt Manila that exists today as the capital of the Republic of the Philippines is a city that carries the gap between what it was before February of 1945 and what it became during the battle. The physical city that existed before the battle, the Spanish colonial heritage of Intramuros, The commercial district, the residential neighborhoods of Malate and Amita, cannot be reconstructed. Buildings can be replaced. The specific accumulated history that makes a 4-century-old walled city different from a reproduction of a 4-century-old walled city cannot be replaced. The San Agustin Church stands inside those walls as the specific and visible evidence of that gap. It survived because its stone construction was thick enough to withstand what destroyed everything around it. What survived shows clearly what was lost. What was lost cannot be restored by any subsequent construction.